Hey guys, welcome back, part 5. So at this point, you should have rebooted. If the system didn't prompt you to reboot after installing the configuration of DHCP, DNS, and the Active Directory DS services, you're going to want to reboot now. There's a bug in the server where it will not prompt you to reboot, but if you don't reboot, you end up with issues when you go through the configuration or the next steps here. So I would suggest that you reboot first. I'll wait. Kidding. Obviously, pause this and then just, when you get back on, kick it back off. All right. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the server manager after you log back into the system. You see the blue bar across the top. Blue bar is waiting for the system to load the configs. We go into ADDS configuration. We're going to see configuration required for Active Directory domain services. Before we actually do the configuration, let's set the Windows firewall the correct way off. To do that, we're going to actually run this command. It's netsh AdvFirewall set all profiles state off. And I'll include this in the description, but this is the way to actually disable the Windows firewall on 2016, 19, and 22 server. You could disable it through the GUI if you decide to go through the control panel and disable it that way, or disable it through the local advanced security. Doing either of those will turn Microsoft Windows Defender on full, and Defender will then think that you're under attack and therefore block everything anyway. So I would recommend just running the command to actually stop the firewall, because if not, you really can't disable it. So in the older versions of Windows, in like 2008 days and prior, there was a way to go into the services and disable the Windows firewall, or you could go into control panel and disable the Windows firewall. But they fixed that because viruses and people that were writing hacker-based software, things to circumvent, security, knew that if they disabled the firewall, it would open all the ports and they'd be able to get in. So Microsoft developed the ability to now use Microsoft Defender, which turns the firewall on higher. So instead of defaulting to off, not on, it defaults to off, everything's blocked. So in order to turn the firewall off, you really need to run the netsh command. So again, it's netsh space AdvFirewall, so it's advanced firewall, space set space all profiles space state space off. Hit enter, and that will give you the command of OK. So at that point, now the Windows firewall is disabled, and Defender's annoyance, or rather security portion of this, is also disabled. So now that we have this disabled, we're going to go into the little flag here where you have the alert, and we're going to click on the one that says promote the server to a domain controller. You could complete the DHCP process. It's better to promote this thing to a DC before we do that. So we're going to click on that. So now, once we're in here, we're going to get 3 options. For the sake of this, we're going to choose to add a new forest. We're going to use ytd.local. So the reason why we're going to do ytd.local is because this is my YouTube channel, and I'm going to use my YouTube domain controller, which is ytd. Now, if you're in a business and you own a domain, like a public-facing domain, like maybe you have, for instance, we'll say Microsoft.com or YouTube.com, you don't want to use those as your internal domain. And the reason why is because of your DNS. So DNS is going to be configured to look at the domain controller for authentication purposes, for file service authentication, for group security. All of that is going to be configured to use this domain. If you use your public-facing domain and you set this, you won't be able to get to your public-facing domain website without having a www record. And if you modify the DNS to point the internal DNS to the outside for these particular websites, it's going to break your ability to authenticate. It'll likely break your internal DNS altogether. You likely won't be able to access any of your servers, your file shares, authenticate to the domain controller. Grouppolicy will stop working. Printers likely will stop working. So it'll bork everything on your internal infrastructure. You don't really want to do that. So either use a shorten, like for instance, if it was Microsoft, you could use msft.local or msft.com, and then know that Microsoft.com is the actual website. That's totally fine. If you want to try like ytd.com versus youtube.com, again, that would be fine too, because if you needed to get to youtube.com, you don't have to set up a www record, and then you don't have to set up a redirect on the web server to allow you to physically access it. It's future-proofing your ability to host websites internally without having to jump through hoops to get to them. So I would just suggest using a .local. Now there's reasons why you use a .com. Sometimes you need a .com if you're going to run a website, web services, or any kind of semantic enterprise vault. In some cases, requires that .com domain in order for it to function correctly, and that may require you to create secondary domain information configurations for your DNS for this to work right. Again, for the sake of this, just try to make it simple. Make it a .local. Make it something that's not your website, so that way it works. All right, so now we're going to click on Next. And next, we're going to get into the domain controller options. So now we're in domain controller options. And in here, we're going to choose our forest function level and our domain function level. Now, if this is just a trial network, or if this is a brand new build, just leave it as 2016. It'll work fine for what you have. But if you're going to create like a test environment where you're going to have things that are like 2008 servers, 2003 servers, things of that nature, then I would suggest not going any further than 2008 as far as your forest and your domain level. That way you could mix and match your domain controllers. You have a 2008 domain controller, 2012, 2016, 2019. If you set it low enough, you could literally control everything. If you set your forest level too high, that's also going to cause issues for older clients. The reason why is the forest level actually controls the policy set. So if you're using like LDAP 1.0, you don't have Office 365, you don't have Microsoft Apps 365, you don't have Azure, but you want to run like an HP UX server, an AIX server, or something to that effect, you're going to want to run the older stuff. 2008 would be the way to go. That'll get you the kind of the transition period, 2008. So that's here, not here. So 2008 R2 is not the transition period. That's Windows 7. 2008 is Vista. Vista was compatible with a XP world, and Vista is also compatible with the Windows 7 8.1 world. Windows 10 and 11 are not compatible with the Vista world. You will have issues having Windows 10 and 11 on them. If that's the case, set the forest and the domain level to 2016. And later in these videos, I will go through how to create group policy for the Windows 7 machines and the legacy configuration using the ability to block out policy configurations and then use enforcement to actually apply only the things that are required. The other thing we're going to do in here is we're going to set the DSRM password. This is the recovery password for your domain in the event that we ever needed to recover it. This is important to keep as encrypted and ridiculous of a password in here as possible. You're also going to want to write this down someplace safe, not in a public place. Don't save it on your file server. That's a bad idea. Don't save it on your desktop. Print it out, put it in an envelope, and stuff it in a desk if you're going to do that. Because in reality, ransomware, hackers, those guys that get into the infrastructure, if they get in under a user account, they still have no access. But if your DSRM password is like terrible and only like 6 characters long or 8 characters long, and it's just a name or something like that, they'll usually find that out within a day, and then they'll have full control of your infrastructure. And if you're running that type of policy for your password system, then likely you don't have advanced audit, you don't have Nagios, you don't have any way to SMTP filter, or SNMP filter rather, you don't have any way to encrypt, you don't have security on your infrastructure, you're asking for trouble. So one of the ways to circumvent that, make this a difficult password to guess. Make anything with an administrative access difficult to guess. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it difficult to guess. And we're going to click Next. We're going to go to the DNS options. The DNS options are going to bark. They're going to say that we don't have an authoritative parent zone, that it can't be found, that there's issues. This is a bug. Ignore it. When we go through the process here, what's going to happen is it's going to write that information to the DNS services anyway. which will create your DNS zones. Everything will work fine. But again, this is stuff that has existed as problems inside of the Microsoft Windows operating system since the days of 2008, when they changed the way you add the domain. The next step here is the NetBIOS name. You can make this really anything you want. I'm just going to leave it as YTD just because that's short and good enough. So you use that to authenticate. So like YTD /administrator is your username. That's how you're authenticating to the domain. So you don't have to put in the .local. It's the shortened version. Again, you can make it anything you want, but for the sake of this, I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm going to click next. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go into paths. So what does a path actually do for you? So that's going to be the storage of your database configuration of the data that you're entering here, as well as your SYSVOL. Your SYSVOL is going to be like your logon scripts and things of that nature. Don't change that location. I've dealt with, over the past couple of years now, people that have decided to change the SYSVOL location to a different location. And you can absolutely do that in a 2008 environment and prior. But in the newer environment, it interacts directly with your policy definitions folder, which is the configuration folder for Windows 10 and 11 to communicate with your domain controller and actually understand what your group policy is telling it to do. And if you move this folder and you don't write policy to point to this new location, the desktops will break and you won't be able to communicate to the domain controller. So anything that you put in place won't work correctly. So for the sake of this, I would leave it. And quite frankly, in the newer versions of the servers in 2012 R2 and after, you have the ability to encrypt these folders. And once you encrypt these folders, there really is no reason to change it to a different location anyway. That's legacy stuff and likely will break your domain controller. So just leave it as is. And then click next. We're going to review the configuration in here. This is going to tell us specifically, all the things that we just set. We know that already, so we're just going to click next. It's going to run through prerequisite checks. And when it does this, it's probably going to bark about using older configurations for NT-based authentication for setting up your domain controller. It's not necessary to change anything like this yet. Once we get the server built and you start going through the policy configurations, then all of that stuff doesn't matter anyway, because it all gets replaced with the newer configuration, newer standards, newer requirements, newer encryption. All of this stuff pretty much dies with this base configuration once you get it configured correctly. And there is quite a bit more to do once we get past this part. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to allow this to do the installation. And after the installation, it is going to prompt you to reboot. You have the choice here to reboot or not reboot. You have to reboot. So once this finishes and it reboots, when it comes back up, the password you logged into the system with just now to get into the system in the first place will be set as your domain admin password. That'll get you back into the system again. I would suggest that you change that to more characters or make it stronger once you have the domain up. Keep in mind that when the system comes back up, it's going to log you directly into the domain account. There is no local account once it comes back up. They got rid of that function in, I think it was 2016. Might have been 2012. I think 2012 got rid of that function where you can have both a local built-in account and a domain login account into a domain controller. That's dead. At any rate, we're going to hit the install. It's going to run through the installation. Once it's finished, it's going to force me to do a reboot. And I will see you guys in the next video, and we'll take it from there. All right, thanks, guys. Like and subscribe for more.